My name is Elowen Lancaster. I am 27 years old, and I walked into a Fulton County courtroom ready to hand over a predictive logistics company I built from scratch just to keep custody of my 3-year-old daughter. Across the center aisle, my mother-in-law adjusted her pearl necklace and smiled at me. It was the smile of a woman who believed she had finally taken out the trash while keeping the gold I spun. She intended to strip me of my life's work, and my cheating husband was using our little girl as the leverage to make it happen. Before the morning was over, my own father would lean across the petitioner table and whisper for me to sign every last asset away. So I did. I gave them the throne. I just did not tell them I had already removed the engine. Welcome back to Fluffy Revenge, where quiet women stop begging for a seat at the table and decide to flip the board instead. If you have ever been the invisible backbone of someone else's success, drop a comment below. Tell me your age, and let me know where you are listening from. And be sure to subscribe because you will want to hear how one line of code dismantled an entire Southern dynasty in a single afternoon. Let me take you inside that courtroom. The air conditioning in the building always smells faintly of floor wax and old paper. A sterile scent that tries and fails to cover up the panic of the people waiting there. I sat with my hands folded in my lap watching condensation slide down the side of my water glass. Across the aisle sat my husband, Preston Caldwell, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than my first server rack. Beside him sat his mother, Vivian. She wore a navy silk dress, the unspoken uniform of Buckhead matriarchs who traced their lineage back to the founding of Atlanta, and look at people like me as vulgar necessities. We were there to divide a life, but practically speaking, they were there to harvest mine. Preston tapped a gold monogrammed pen against the mahogany table. I bought him that pen to celebrate our Series A funding round. He never wrote a single line of code. He never pitched a client on the technical specs. He never stayed up until 3 in the morning untangling a broken data pipeline so a shipping hub in Savannah could open on time. But Preston had the Caldwell name, the country club golf handicap, and the right smile for the donors and investors. In Vivian's world, that made him the rightful owner of Caldwell Analytics. The terms laid out in front of me were extortion masked as a settlement agreement. Preston's legal team, a trio of men with matching haircuts and expensive watches, had spent the morning outlining a stark reality. If I fought for my startup, Preston would file for primary custody of our daughter, Lily. He would drag the battle out for years. Vivian had already promised to fund his legal war chest, tapping into whatever remained of the traditional capital her family hoarded. She knew a Georgia judge would look favorably upon a legacy Southern family standing against an overworked new money tech mother. They wanted it all: the brand, the office space, the client list, and the revenue. The judge flipped through the thick stack of papers on his bench. He looked over his glasses at me. He asked if I understood the stipulations of this agreement. I looked down at the signature line. One stroke of ink would transfer my entire equity stake. In exchange, Preston would waive all custody rights to Lily. He was trading his own child for a corporate title, and he looked bored while doing it. Beside me, my father shifted in his seat. Jim Lancaster wore a neat, off-the-rack suit that fit a little loose around his shoulders. He spent 40 years managing rail yard logistics in Doraville, a man who built his life on concrete and steel, not garden parties and trust funds. He understood structures, loads, and leverage better than any lawyer in that room. He leaned in close to me, his voice a low, steady rumble that only I could hear. "Sign it all away." "L," he whispered. I picked up my cheap plastic ballpoint pen. My hand did not shake. I wrote my name on the dotted line, pressing hard enough to leave an indent on the wood beneath the paper. A sharp, distinct breath hitched across the aisle. Vivian was smiling. It was not a broad grin, just a tight, satisfied smirk that pulled at the corners of her mouth. She leaned over and whispered something into Preston's ear. He straightened his tie, capped his gold pen, and looked at me with a mixture of pity and triumph. They believed they had just excised the hired help from their legacy. The judge struck his gavel. The marriage was over. The company belonged to Preston. I stood up, packed my legal pad into my briefcase, and walked down the center aisle. I did not look back at the Caldwells. I pushed through the heavy double doors and stepped out into the thick, humid Georgia morning. The heat hit me instantly, sweet with the smell of exhaust and magnolia. My father walked beside me in silence until we reached the parking garage. We reached his truck, and he unlocked the doors. "You good?" he asked, looking across the roof of the cab. "I am fine, Dad," I said. I sat in the passenger seat and pulled my laptop from the briefcase. I tethered it to my phone, watching the network connection bar turn green in the top corner of the screen. The terminal window opened with a swift keystroke. The dark screen reflected my own face back at me for a second before the text populated. I typed a single query into the command line. It was an execution script aimed at the core database of Caldwell Analytics. They wanted the company. They wanted the brand and the corner office. They just never bothered to read the appendix of the legal document they forced me to sign. I hit the enter key. "Done," I said, closing the lid. Now, to understand how a data scientist allowed herself to be maneuvered into that corner in the first place, I have to take you back 4 years. To understand how a data scientist allowed herself to be maneuvered into a corner, you have to understand the specific gravity of Atlanta. There are 2 distinct cities living on top of each other. One is a booming modern tech hub, fueled by fresh capital and fiber optic cables. The other is a rigid, whispering aristocracy, where pedigree functions as a currency far more stable than equity. I grew up in Doraville. My childhood was scored by the screech of freight trains and the smell of diesel from the rail yard my father managed. Preston grew up a few miles and an entire universe away, navigating private school galas and country club tennis courts. Preston was striking in the effortless way only generational comfort can produce. He possessed a resonant, easy laugh and a handshake that made venture capitalists forget to ask hard questions. He sold the image of success. He wore it like a bespoke jacket. But beneath the tailoring, there was no structure. When we launched Caldwell Analytics, the division of labor seemed natural, even pragmatic. I wrote the code. I built the predictive models that saved regional shipping hubs millions by anticipating supply chain bottlenecks before they formed. I spent my days swimming in raw data, finding efficiency in chaos. Preston, meanwhile, took clients to bourbon tastings at the Capital City Club. He charmed logistics managers on the back nine. He was the gleaming hood ornament, and I was the engine block. I believed we were building an empire together. I treated the marriage the same way I treated a fragile dataset, smoothing out the rough edges, ignoring minor variables, and focusing on the overall trend line. Vivian Caldwell, however, operated on a different algorithm. My mother-in-law was a woman who could deliver a lethal insult disguised as a polite inquiry about your health. To her, my profession was a vulgar necessity. The Caldwells possessed a surname carved into local hospital wings, but the trusts had dried up a decade ago. They were cash-poor and status-rich, living in a sprawling Tudor estate that bled money in property taxes and slate roof repairs. I was the quiet influx of capital keeping their ship afloat. I paid for Preston's imported Italian wool suits. I covered the exorbitant monthly minimums at the country club so he could maintain his networking facade. When Vivian's antique Jaguar needed a transmission rebuild, the invoice quietly found its way to my desk. I paid it without a single word of complaint. I viewed these expenses as a social tax, the cost of admission into a family I desperately wanted to belong to. I thought funding their lifestyle would eventually yield their respect. They gladly took the money, but they systematically erased the woman earning it. The mechanism of this erasure crystallized during a spring garden party at Vivian's estate. Dogwood blossoms drifted over the immaculate lawn like snow. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of mint juleps and miniature crab cakes. I sat at a wrought iron patio table near the hedges, my laptop open. A major client out of Savannah was experiencing a server outage, and I needed to push a patch to their routing software before the morning shifts began. The screen threw a cool blue light against my face as my fingers flew across the keyboard. I was as deep in the command terminal hunting a syntax error when a shadow fell across the table. Vivian stood there, flanked by a state senator and his wife. She wore a lavender suit, her posture rigid, a crystal glass sweating in her hand. "Elowen, dear," Vivian said. Her voice carried that distinct syrupy southern cadence that coats every syllable in sugar while burying a razor blade inside. Before I could greet the guests, Vivian reached out. Her manicured fingers clamped onto the top edge of my laptop screen. With a smooth, practiced motion, she pushed it down. The screen clicked shut, severing my connection to the server. I stared at the silver lid of my computer, my heart doing a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. "We are entertaining," Vivian admonished lightly, offering the senator's wife an apologetic sigh. She placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that looked maternal to the observers, but felt like a vice grip. "You will have to forgive my daughter-in-law. Preston works her so hard. She does all his little bookkeeping tasks, and she simply never knows when to clock out." Bookkeeping. The word hung in the humid air, heavy and deliberate. She was not just interrupting my work. She was rewriting my identity. To these political donors and socialites, I was not the founder of a predictive analytics firm. I was a glorified secretary managing her son's receipts. I looked at Preston. He stood a few yards away, a drink in his hand, laughing at a joke. He saw his mother close my laptop. He heard the introduction. He merely raised his glass to me, offered a charming wink, and turned back to his conversation. I did not yell. I did not flip the wrought iron table. I offered the senator a tight, polite smile, apologized for the intrusion, and walked back into the house to reopen my terminal in the suffocating heat of the guest bathroom. I told myself it did not matter. The code worked whether Vivian respected it or not. The company was growing. I was the strong one. I could absorb the slights to keep the peace. That blind loyalty held its structural integrity for another 2 years. It held until a quiet, unremarkable Tuesday evening in November. Our daughter Lily was asleep in her crib down the hall. Rain lashed against the windows of our home, a modern glass-heavy build I had purchased outright after our Series B funding. I sat in my home office nursing a cold cup of coffee. I was running a diagnostic test on a new spatial tracking feature designed for our fleet management clients. To test the live GPS pinging, I needed an active node. Months prior, Preston had offered his company SUV as a test subject, allowing me to hardwire a tracker into the diagnostic port. I opened the testing suite and pinged the vehicle. The API returned a string of data translating the raw coordinates into a location on the map overlay. I glanced at my secondary monitor where Preston's shared calendar glowed brightly. The time block for this evening was labeled as a client dinner at a high-end steakhouse in Buckhead scheduled from 7 until 10. I looked back at the map. The blue dot representing Preston's vehicle was nowhere near the steakhouse. I refreshed the ping. The dot remained stationary. I zoomed in, letting the satellite view render the buildings. The SUV was parked in a subterranean garage 5 miles south, sitting perfectly still beneath an IP address mapped to a boutique luxury hotel in Midtown. I sat back in my ergonomic chair. The rain drummed against the glass. In data science, we rely on a core principle. You trust the data, not the narrative. Humans lie. They obfuscate. They tell you they are eating steak with logistics managers. But a GPS module bolted to a chassis does not care about your pedigree, your charm, or your calendar invites. It only reports the math. I ran a secondary script pulling the historical location data for the past 90 days. I cross-referenced the geographical pings with Preston's calendar entries. The screen populated with red flags. A golf outing mapped to a residential address in Decatur. A late-night board meeting mapped to the same boutique hotel in Midtown. The pattern was clean, repetitive, and statistically impossible to misinterpret. My husband was not where he claimed to be. When ordinary people discover a fundamental betrayal in their home, they tend to react with immediate emotion. They cry. They throw heavy objects. They call their closest friends in the middle of the night seeking comfort. I did none of those things. In my profession, an unexpected output is not a tragedy to be mourned. It is a discrepancy to be investigated. A data scientist looks at a failing marriage the exact same way she looks at a broken algorithm. You do not weep over the error message. You isolate the variable causing the system to crash. My husband was a variable that had stopped behaving according to the established parameters. The only logical response was to audit the entire environment. I stood up from my ergonomic chair and walked down the hallway of the quiet house. Lily was still breathing softly in her crib, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, predictable rhythm. I adjusted her knitted blanket. It closed the nursery door until the latch clicked shut and returned to my office. The rain continued to beat against the glass windows, a chaotic drumline that contrasted with the ordered silence of my dual monitors. I pulled up our joint banking records, opened a fresh spreadsheet, and began exporting the raw transaction history for the past 24 months. I laid Preston's shared calendar on the left monitor and the financial ledger on the right. Then I layered the GPS coordinates from his vehicle over both of them. Patterns emerged from the noise almost instantly. People think lies are formless, chaotic things, but lies are behaviors, and human behaviors create habits. Habits leave digital footprints. I highlighted a specific recurring expense on the spreadsheet. $450 charged every second Thursday of the month. The merchant category code identified the transaction as dining and entertainment. Preston had meticulously categorized these entries in our budgeting software as a recurring business lunch at the Capital City Club. He claimed he was hosting regional supply chain managers to secure quarterly contracts. I checked the GPS logs for those specific Thursday afternoons. The blue dot representing his luxury SUV never went anywhere near the Capital City Club. It traveled straight to a boutique hotel in Midtown Atlanta and remained entirely stationary for 3 hours. The math was elegant and cruel. $450 was not a lunch tab for executives. It was the exact current market price of a luxury day rate room in that specific zip code. The infidelity materialized on my screen line by line, a ghost built out of timestamps and routing numbers. I felt a cold tightness in my chest, a physical reaction to the collapse of trust, but I pushed the sensation down into a locked box. I could process the death of my romance later. Right now, I was hunting anomalies. Cheating is common. It is a predictable human failing driven by ego and opportunity. But as I stared at the columns of numbers, a new discrepancy caught my eye. The frequency of the hotel charges did not align with the cash flow in our personal accounts. Preston possessed expensive tastes, and his salary, while generous, could not sustain his bespoke tailoring, his country club fees, and a parallel life in Midtown. The personal ledger balanced perfectly. That meant the funds for his indiscretions were originating from a different source. I needed closer access to the core infrastructure. I left my home office, walked down the stairs, and unlocked the heavy steel door of our basement server room. The ambient temperature dropped 10 degrees instantly. The tall server racks hummed with a low, constant vibration, blinking with blue and green indicator lights. These machines housed the proprietary databases for Caldwell Analytics. This room was my true sanctuary, the brain of the company I birthed. I sat down at the local terminal, wrapped a thick wool sweater around my shoulders to ward off the chill of the cooling fans, and bypassed the front-end interface. I tapped directly into the corporate SQL database. I wrote a query to filter the operating budget expenditures for the current fiscal year. I targeted the miscellaneous vendor payouts, the consulting fees, and the specific budget lines Preston managed independently, under the guise of client relations and marketing. The query executed in 3 seconds. The results populated the dark terminal screen in bright white text. I found the shadow economy of my own marriage. Preston was not just cheating on me. He was systematically extracting capital from our startup. I had created multiple phantom vendor accounts within our billing software. He was funneling legitimate company revenue through a series of generic limited liability companies. The invoices looked incredibly boring on the surface, labeled as strategic market research and regional logistics consulting. But they were hollow. There was no research. There was no consulting. It was a crude mechanism to siphon cash directly out of the operating budget. I traced the banking pathways of these phantom vendors. A portion of the stolen funds was clearly padding his personal discretionary spending, paying for the Midtown hotel rooms, the expensive dinners, and the gifts for a woman who was not his wife. But the bulk of the embezzled money was traveling somewhere else entirely. One of the largest shell companies received a monthly transfer of $12,000. I pulled the registration record of that specific shell company through the Georgia Secretary of State business portal. I cross-referenced the mailing address and the registered agent. The agent was not a logistics consultant. It was a property management firm operated by Preston Caldwell. The puzzle pieces clicked together with sickening precision. Vivian's real estate investments had been failing for years. The sprawling Tudor estate in Buckhead, the antique Jaguar, the lavish garden parties catering to state senators. All of it was a fragile facade. The aristocratic lifestyle of the Caldwell family was being funded by the quiet illegal draining of my operating budget. Preston was stealing from the company to pay for his mistress, and he was stealing even more to keep his mother solvent. They were using the revenue generated by the code I wrote to prop up their illusions. They viewed Caldwell Analytics not as a business to nurture, but as a personal piggy bank to be smashed open whenever they required cash. They felt entitled to the money simply because Preston possessed the correct last name and the right smile. I sat alone in the freezing server room, bathed in the pale glow of the monitor. The hum of the cooling fans sounded like a swarm of insects in the dark. The screen in front of me proved my husband and my mother-in-law were actively draining the company I built to zero. They were holding a parasite to the artery of my life's work, smiling at me across dinner tables while they bled me dry. I pressed my hands against my face, feeling the cold transfer from my fingertips to my cheeks. I knew I could not confront them with tears. They would only use my emotions against me. I had to build a trap they could not see until it was too late. I emerged from the freezing basement server room just as dawn began to bleed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my kitchen. The storm had passed during the early hours, leaving behind a pale, washed-out sky and a damp silence across the neighborhood. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, my movements mechanical. Preston wandered down the stairs an hour later, wearing crisp linen trousers and a pressed Oxford shirt. He looked pristine, every inch the Buckhead executive smelling faintly of expensive cedar cologne. He poured himself a cup, humming a soft tune, oblivious to the fact that his digital ghost had kept me awake all night mapping his betrayals. I wanted to offer him a chance to be human. I wanted to see if there was any conscience left beneath the bespoke tailoring, or if the man I married had been replaced by a parasite. I sat at the marble kitchen island, a single printed spreadsheet resting near my mug. I kept my voice casual, carefully stripping away any accusatory tone. I mentioned that our quarterly tax preparation required some clarification on a few specific vendor payments. I pointed to a line item for a consulting firm, one of the phantom entities actively funneling cash to his mother. I asked him if he could provide the deliverables for that specific contract, mentioning that our accounting software flagged the entry due to incomplete documentation. I watched his face, waiting for the system response. Preston stopped stirring his coffee. His shoulders went rigid. The charming facade he wore like armor cracked, revealing the panicked boy underneath. He did not ask to review the spreadsheet. He did not offer to pull the physical files from his briefcase. He deflected instantly, his voice rising a half octave into a defensive register. He claimed the expenditures were confidential client acquisitions, complex networking investments that I would not understand because I only handled the back-end code. His eyes darted toward the hallway, seeking an escape route from the math sitting on the counter. He pulled his phone from his pocket, muttered a flimsy excuse about an urgent call with a board member, and retreated to the patio. I watched through the glass doors as he paced the wet flagstones, speaking frantically into the receiver. He was not calling a board member. He was calling his handler. Less than 40 minutes later, tires crunched on our gravel driveway. Vivian swept into my home without knocking, using the spare key I foolishly provided her years ago. She wore a tailored beige suit, her signature pearls resting heavily against her collarbone. She did not greet me. She moved directly to the kitchen island, flanked by Preston, who now looked emboldened by her sudden presence. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of inherited privilege closing ranks against the outsider who dared to audit their spending. I remained seated, my hands resting flat on the cool granite countertop. I expected a denial regarding the missing finances. I expected them to fabricate invoices, spin a lie about sudden business expenses, or attempt to justify the consulting fees. Vivian orchestrated a different strategy entirely. She bypassed the money and launched a preemptive strike on my reality. She placed a manicured hand on Preston's arm and looked at me with an expression of profound manufactured pity. She told me I looked exhausted. She said my obsession with the startup was taking a visible toll on my mental health. She suggested that sitting in a dark office staring at screens all night was making me paranoid, causing me to invent wild financial conspiracies. You are driving him away. Elowen, she said smoothly, her tone dripping with false maternal concern. You bury yourself in your computers, ignoring your husband and your daughter, and then you project your own failures as a wife onto Preston to justify your neglect. The accusation was a calculated, staggering blow. I worked 80-hour weeks to build the asset funding their entire aristocratic lifestyle. Yet she was framing my labor as child neglect. I glanced at Preston. He stood there nodding slowly, adopting the posture of a weary, long-suffering spouse. He had spent the previous afternoon in a midtown hotel room with another woman using my operating budget to pay for the luxury linens, and he was currently agreeing that I was the one destroying our family. Vivian stepped closer to the island, her fingers reaching up to adjust her pearl necklace. The syrupy sweetness evaporated from her voice, leaving behind cold, hard steel. She laid out the governing rules of their universe. Preston is the face of this operation. She stated, her words sharp and precise. He is the reason investors return our calls. He is the reason the shipping hubs sign the contracts. You are merely the back end, the hired help. Do not forget your place. If you continue to embarrass him with these delusional interrogations, there will be severe consequences. She let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing the threat to fill the room before delivering the final blow. If you force a public issue out of this, we will take Lily, Vivian said. Preston will file for full custody immediately. And let me assure you, a Georgia judge will always favor a proper Southern family over an unstable, overworked tech girl. We have the resources, the political connections, and the legacy. You have a server rack in a basement. Who do you think the courts will trust to raise a child? I looked at Preston again. He was smiling. It was a small, cruel curve of the lips, a gesture of pure arrogance. He felt invincible, hiding behind his mother's social armor, utilizing his own daughter as a human shield to protect his embezzlement. They were holding my child hostage to secure their unrestricted access to the company treasury. They knew I would burn the world down before I let them take Lily, and they were using that exact devotion to trap me. Vivian smoothed the front of her jacket, returning to her polite aristocratic cadence as if she had not just threatened to kidnap my daughter through the legal system. She presented their solution: to save the marriage and provide a stable, traditional environment for Lily. I needed to step down. They demanded I relinquish the title of Chief Executive Officer and appoint Preston as the sole director of the board. I could continue writing my little programs in the background, providing the necessary labor. But Preston would maintain total control over the finances and the corporate direction. It was the only way Vivian insisted to prove I was committed to my family, rather than my own selfish ego. I sat very still, my mind racing through decision trees and predictive outcomes. If I argued, if I presented the GPS logs and the banking traces right, then they would escalate. They would take Lily that afternoon under the guise of an emergency custody order fueled by their fabricated claims of my mental instability. The Caldwells knew every judge in Fulton County while I only knew the data. I could not fight them on a battlefield they owned. I needed to shift the war to a theater they could not comprehend. I lowered my eyes, projecting total submission. I let my shoulders slump, mirroring the defeat they expected to see. I told them I heard what they were saying. I kept my voice quiet and shaky, whispering that I needed time to process everything, that I would think about their proposal and try to be better. Vivian offered a satisfied nod, victorious. Preston exhaled, his rigid posture relaxing into lazy confidence. I stood up, walked past them without making eye contact, and climbed the stairs. I entered my home office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The house was quiet except for the distant murmur of Vivian and Preston congratulating themselves in the kitchen below. I sat at my desk, picked up my phone, and dialed the only man who knew how to dismantle a faulty structure. My father answered on the second ring. My father arrived at my house 30 minutes after I called him. Jim Lancaster did not knock. He used the spare key I gave him the day we moved in, letting himself through the front door with the heavy, measured steps of a man who spent 4 decades walking across active rail yards. He wore faded denim jeans and a flannel shirt, a stark contrast to the sleek minimalist architecture of my foyer. For 40 years, my dad managed logistics at the Doraville freight hub. He spent his entire adult life making sure thousands of tons of steel and cargo moved precisely where they needed to go. He understood structural integrity. He knew exactly how much strain a coupling could take before it snapped. More importantly, he knew how to clean up a derailment without wasting time on tears. I met him in the kitchen. He took one look at my face, walked past the expensive espresso machine Preston bought last Christmas, and opened the refrigerator. He bypassed the imported sparkling water, found a cheap domestic beer he had left during his last visit, and popped the top. He sat down at the marble island, resting his calloused hands on the polished stone. He did not ask how I was feeling. He asked for the damage report. I laid everything out for him. I kept my voice steady, treating the betrayal of my marriage like a quarterly loss statement. I explained the GPS tracking on Preston's luxury vehicle. I detailed the boutique hotel charges. I showed him the spreadsheets highlighting the phantom vendor accounts and traced the flow of stolen capital directly into Vivian's failing property management firm. I explained the ambush that had occurred just an hour prior. I recounted Vivian's thinly veiled threat to drag Lily through a brutal custody battle using their generational wealth and social influence to paint me as an unfit, unstable mother. I waited for the paternal outrage. I expected my dad to slam his fist on the marble. I anticipated a lecture about hiring the most ruthless divorce attorney in Fulton County to fight them for every single dollar I had earned. I thought he would tell me to burn their reputation to the ground in open court. My father did not do any of those things. He took a slow sip of his beer, his pale blue eyes scanning the spreadsheets I had printed. He studied the numbers with the same quiet intensity he used to evaluate a fractured load-bearing beam. He remained silent for several minutes, letting the weight of the Caldwell family extortions settle into the quiet house. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and remarkably detached. He asked a question that shifted the entire foundation of my problem. What exactly makes this company valuable? He asked, tapping the edge of the paper. I blinked, caught off guard by the pivot. I started to explain the client roster, the shipping contracts, and the monthly recurring revenue, but he raised a hand to stop me. That is just cash flow, he said gently. Cash flow can disappear overnight. I want to know what the actual asset is. If Preston takes over the title of Chief Executive Officer tomorrow, what does he physically own? I looked at the spreadsheets, then back at my father. I explained the reality of my industry. Caldwell Analytics was not a traditional business. We did not own warehouses or truck fleets. The brand name was just a polished shell designed to make corporate clients feel comfortable. The true value resided entirely in the proprietary algorithm I had written. It was a predictive engine that ingested millions of data points from global weather patterns to port congestion metrics and spat out optimized routing schedules. The shipping hubs paid us millions because my code saved them tens of millions in delays. Without the algorithm, I told him the company is just a collection of expensive office furniture and a logo on a glass door. The clients do not care about Preston's smile or his golf handicap. They care about the accuracy of the predictive models. Preston could not write a single line of that code if he had a century to try. My dad nodded slowly, a small, knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth. He took another sip of his beer and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the island. You are looking at this like a daughter who just got her heart broken, he said. You need to look at this like an engineer facing a hostile takeover. Preston and Vivian do not want to run a software business. They do not understand data, and they do not care about supply chain efficiency. They care about status. They want the prestige of the corner office and the steady stream of cash to fund their country club dues. They want a throne. He paused, letting the metaphor hang in the air between us. So give them the throne. He continued, his voice dropping into a low, decisive register. Give them the title. Give them the brand name. Hand them the keys to the kingdom. Just take the engine out first. I stared at him, my mind spinning as the brilliance of the strategy clicked into place. The Caldwells were threatening to take my daughter because they believed I would sacrifice anything to protect the company I built. They assumed the business and the code were one inseparable entity. They viewed Caldwell Analytics as a physical fortress that could be conquered and occupied by the victor. They did not understand that software is not a building. Software is intellectual property. It can be moved, licensed, revoked, and relocated with a few keystrokes. If I fought them for the company in a traditional divorce proceeding, the court would freeze the assets. The judge would evaluate the marital property, and Preston would leverage his social connections to paint me as the villain. Vivian would exhaust my legal fund and traumatize Lily in the process. But if I surrendered the company willingly, I removed their leverage instantly. They would have no reason to fight for custody of Lily if they got exactly what they demanded. I could secure my daughter's future by handing Preston the corporate crown he desired so desperately. All I had to do was hollow out the inside of the crown before I placed it on his head. I could restructure the intellectual property. I could build a legal firewall around the predictive algorithm, separating the true value of the technology from the vulnerable shell of Caldwell Analytics. I would let them steal the car, but only after I unbolted the engine block and hid it in my own garage. A profound sense of clarity washed over me, cold and refreshing. The panic that had gripped my chest since I first discovered the GPS anomalies evaporated, replaced by the sharp-focused energy of a data scientist with a new project. I was no longer a victim trapped in a toxic Southern dynasty. I was the architect of their impending collapse. My dad watched the realization settle over my face. He finished his beer, set the empty can on the counter, and pushed himself up from the stool. He told me he was going to go check the oil in my car, a quiet excuse to give me the space I needed to work. He kissed the top of my head, a rare gesture of deep affection, and walked out to the garage. I turned away from the kitchen island and walked back up the stairs to my home office. I sat down at my desk, the rain finally clearing outside the window to reveal a bright, piercing afternoon sun. I opened my laptop. I needed to draft a new corporate structure. I needed to create an impenetrable legal and technical architecture that would allow me to hand my husband a multi-million-dollar empire that was secretly worth less than the paper it was printed on. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before I began to type. The next 90 days required a performance worthy of a stage actor. I had to become the exact woman my mother-in-law accused me of being. A fractured, insecure wife terrified of losing her family. A woman so desperate to repair her marriage that she would surrender her autonomy for a scrap of validation. It was the most difficult role I have ever assumed. Preston thrived on the new dynamic. He began coming into the office later, issuing arbitrary directives to the junior engineers and taking credit for optimizations he did not understand. I lowered my eyes during board meetings. I apologized for speaking out of turn. I allowed him to correct my technical reports in front of our staff. Every time I swallowed my pride, I pictured a structural blueprint carefully detaching the support beams from a heavy roof, behind the facade of my submission. I began the quiet clinical execution of the trap. Preston believed power was derived from loud declarations in glass boardrooms. I knew power was derived from filing cabinets and state registries. Because I was still the sole managing director of Caldwell Analytics on paper, I possessed the unilateral authority to restructure our vendor relationships. I did not need Preston to sign anything yet. I just needed him to remain distracted by his own ego. I contacted an intellectual property attorney based in Austin, Texas. I chose a firm 3 states away to ensure Vivian could not use her Atlanta social network to catch wind of my activities. I instructed the attorney to form a new anonymous holding entity in Delaware, registered to a post office box. We named it Lancaster Data Solutions. My name was buried beneath layers of registered agents and corporate privacy shields. On the surface, it was just another faceless vendor in a sea of corporate paperwork, with the holding entity established. I spent the late hours of the night drafting the core mechanism of my revenge. It was a software licensing agreement. The contract was dense, filled with technical jargon that would make a traditional lawyer glaze over with boredom. The premise was simple and lethal. Caldwell Analytics would sell the proprietary predictive algorithm, the actual engine I wrote from scratch, to Lancaster Data Solutions, for a nominal fee of $1. In exchange, Lancaster Data Solutions would license the software back to Caldwell Analytics on a revocable month-to-month basis. I sat at my kitchen island at 2 in the morning, listening to the hum of the refrigerator reviewing the drafted pages. The legal architecture was flawless. On the ledger, Caldwell Analytics still appeared wealthy. We still had the prime office space in Buckhead. We still had the chic logo and the impressive client roster. But the true value of the enterprise had been surgically extracted. The logistics company now owned nothing but ergonomic chairs, a brand name, and the exorbitant commercial debt Preston had secretly accrued to fund his lifestyle. The actual product, the predictive code that kept the shipping hubs functioning, now belonged entirely to me. The contract included a very specific termination clause. Lancaster Data Solutions reserved the right to revoke the software license immediately without prior notice upon any change in the executive leadership structure of Caldwell Analytics. The trap was armed. If Preston forced me out and took the throne, the license would automatically sever. The company would instantly turn into an empty shell. The execution required impeccable timing. A premature filing would alert the bank to a transfer of assets, triggering a financial review before I secured my custody arrangement. I needed Preston to feel invincible. I needed him to drop his guard entirely, so I could slide the restructuring paperwork past the state registry without his notice. I found my window of opportunity in early March. Preston announced he was attending a 3-day supply chain logistics conference in Miami. He packed a leather bag filled with linen shirts and expensive loafers, kissing my cheek with a practiced hollow affection before driving to the airport. I knew he was not attending a conference. I had already checked the GPS tracker on his vehicle. The blue dot was parked long-term at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, and my spreadsheet confirmed a flight itinerary for 2 people to a luxury resort in the Bahamas. He was taking his mistress to the Caribbean using funds he drained from my operating budget. I waved goodbye from the porch, holding our daughter Lily on my hip. I waited until his luxury SUV turned the corner and disappeared from view. Then I put Lily in her high chair, handed her a bowl of sliced strawberries, and walked into my home office. The state of Georgia offers an expedited filing service for corporate amendments if you pay a premium fee. I logged into the Secretary of State portal using my executive credentials. The screen glowed bright and sterile. I uploaded the transfer of asset documents, the sale of the intellectual property, and the new licensing agreement. I hovered my finger over the mouse pad. For a fraction of a second, the weight of the last 4 years pressed down on my chest. I thought about the garden parties where Vivian erased my identity. I thought about the hotel charges funded by my late nights fixing broken servers. I thought about Preston threatening to take my child simply to maintain his access to my bank account. I pressed the button. The progress bar filled with a swift green line. The portal confirmed the submission. The documents were officially filed and stamped by the state registry. The transfer was permanent. The intellectual property was now locked safely inside Lancaster Data Solutions, waiting behind a firewall that Preston did not even know existed. I closed the laptop and walked back into the kitchen. Lily smiled at me, her hands sticky with strawberry juice. I wiped her face with a damp towel, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over my shoulders. Preston was sitting on a beach in the Bahamas, believing he was the master of his universe, unaware that he was sunbathing on a foundation of sand I had just washed away. When he returned from his trip tanned and arrogant, he would initiate the final phase of his plan. He would demand my resignation. He would threaten my access to my daughter. He would orchestrate a legal ambush, fully expecting me to crumble under the pressure of his inherited power. I spent the remainder of the weekend preparing my demeanor for the final battle. I practiced my tears. I perfected my look of devastation. I was ready to let him win the war he thought we were fighting so I could end him in the war I had already won. Preston came back from Miami on a Tuesday. His skin carried a fresh bronze tint, and he smelled of sea salt and expensive rum. He did not unpack his leather duffel bag. He left it sitting by the front door, a subtle indicator that he did not intend to stay long. He spent the evening pacing the hardwood floors of the living room, speaking in hushed tones on his mobile phone. I sat on the floor of the nursery building, a block tower, with Lily waiting for the inevitable strike. The strike arrived at 9 the next morning. A process server rang the doorbell. He was a tired-looking man holding a thick manila envelope. He asked to confirm my name, handed me the package, and walked back to his sedan without another word. I took the envelope to the kitchen island and broke the seal. The legal filing was thick, printed on heavy bond paper that carried the letterhead of a prestigious downtown law firm. The Caldwell family had spared no expense. As I read through the motion, I marveled at the sheer fiction they had managed to draft. Preston was filing for divorce. Alongside the standard dissolution petitions, he had filed an emergency motion for primary physical and legal custody of Lily. The justifications were a masterpiece of manipulation. The petition painted me as an unfit, neglectful mother. It claimed my dedication to the company created an unstable environment for a toddler. Preston documented the long hours I spent in the basement server room, twisting my commitment to our financial survival into a narrative of parental abandonment. He demanded full ownership of Caldwell Analytics, citing his role as the public face who secured the contracts and maintained client relations. He argued that my role was easily replaceable back-end support, while his networking skills were the true engine of the enterprise. He wanted to erase me from my daughter's life and my own company in a single judicial stroke. Before the shock of the paperwork could even settle into the quiet morning, the sound of heavy diesel engines rumbled outside my window. A large white moving truck backed slowly into my driveway, crushing the edges of my manicured lawn. I walked to the front door and opened it. Vivian Caldwell stood on my porch, flanked by 3 men wearing matching moving company uniforms. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and held a clipboard, looking every bit the conquering general arriving to pillage a defeated territory. She did not bother to knock or offer a greeting. She simply signaled the movers to follow her inside. "What are you doing, Vivian?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. She stopped in the foyer and offered a cold, predatory smile. She informed me that Preston had decided it was best for everyone if he maintained residence in the marital home to provide stability for Lily during the transition. Since the house was purchased with company funds, she reasoned it rightfully belonged to him. She advised me to pack my personal belongings quickly and quietly. "You should pack lightly, Elowen," she purred, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. "A small apartment is so much easier for a single woman to maintain. In the old aristocracy of Atlanta, dominance is often asserted through the control of physical space and material heirlooms." Vivian pointed her silver pen toward the formal dining room. She instructed the movers to begin wrapping the 12-seat mahogany table and the matching silk-upholstered chairs. It was an antique set she had gifted us for our wedding, a piece she constantly reminded me had been in her family for 3 generations. She wanted me to scream. She wanted me to block the doorway, to throw a tantrum, to provide the exact hysterical behavior her son had just documented in his legal filing. She was trying to manufacture the evidence they needed for the upcoming custody hearing. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I leaned against the doorframe, crossed my arms, and watched the men dismantle the heavy table. I kept my face entirely blank. I knew the dining room set was just a distraction. A heavy piece of wood that meant nothing in the grand scheme of my architecture. Let her claim a hollow victory. She thought she was establishing dominance by taking my furniture, entirely unaware that I had already taken the digital infrastructure of her son's future. "You can take the buffet cabinet as well," I told the movers, my voice steady and detached. "It matches the table." Vivian faltered for a fraction of a second. My compliance unnerved her. She expected a war over the mahogany, not a calm surrender. She narrowed her eyes, searching my face for signs of a breakdown, but found only quiet acceptance. She eventually turned on her heel and marched back out to the driveway, barking orders at the men to load the truck faster. I watched them drive away with a dining set that represented a legacy they were about to lose. That afternoon, I drove to a discreet office park in Sandy Springs. I sat across a polished glass desk from Marcus, a veteran family law attorney my father had recommended. Marcus was a pragmatic man who specialized in high-asset divorces. He possessed a sharp mind and a realistic understanding of the Fulton County judicial system. He read through Preston's emergency motion, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The office was quiet, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. When he finished reading, he set the papers down and looked at me with a grave expression. "This is a severe maneuver," Elowen Marcus said. "The Caldwell family has deep roots in this county. They donate to the judicial election campaigns. They play golf with the judges. when a legacy family claims a new money spouse is an unstable mother. The courts tend to listen. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He explained the grim reality of the battle ahead. If we fought for both the company and primary custody, the judge might attempt to split the baby. To appear impartial, the court could award Preston the business he claimed to run while granting me custody. Or worse, if Preston's lawyers successfully painted my long hours as neglect, I could lose the company and find myself with restricted visitation rights to my own daughter. We need to decide what matters most, Marcus advised. Fighting a multi-front war against the Caldwells is dangerous. They have the stamina and the capital to bleed us dry in discovery. You might have to choose between your life's work and your child. I listened to his assessment, appreciating his candor. He saw the board exactly as Preston and Vivian saw it. He saw a zero-sum game where I was outmatched by social pedigree and legal maneuvering. He did not know that the board had already been flipped. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the software licensing agreement I had drafted and filed weeks ago. I slid the thick packet of paper across the glass desk. I told him to read the addendum on the final page. Marcus picked up the document. He scanned the legal jargon, his brow furrowing as he traced the transfer of the intellectual property to Lancaster Data Solutions. He read the revocation clause twice. He slowly lowered the paper, his eyes widening as the implications of the corporate restructuring washed over him. I smiled at him. It was a cold, calculated expression. I am not fighting for the company, Marcus, I said softly. I am trading it. The deposition took place 2 weeks later in a sterile conference room on the 40th floor of a Peachtree Street high-rise. The air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous note, chilling the room to a temperature designed to keep opposing parties awake and uncomfortable. Marcus sat to my right, unpacking his legal pads with deliberate, unhurried movements. Across the expanse of polished mahogany sat Preston, flanked by his lead counsel, a man named Sterling Vance. Vance was a legal predator wearing a bespoke suit. He built his reputation in Fulton County by turning high net worth divorces into relentless wars of attrition, burying spouses in discovery paperwork until they surrendered out of sheer exhaustion. Preston hired him for his teeth. Vivian, seated in a high-back leather chair situated carefully in the corner of the room, had undoubtedly paid his staggering retainer. She wore a tailored emerald suit today, observing the proceedings with the quiet, predatory stillness of a hawk watching a field mouse. Vivian needed this victory. Her own real estate portfolio was bleeding capital every month, and my software company was the only lifeboat large enough to save her sinking social status. The initial hours of the meeting were brutal by design. Vance launched a sustained hostile assault on my character, my work schedule, and my fitness as a mother. He slammed thick binders of printed emails onto the table, highlighting timestamps that proved I was writing code at 2 a.m. He spun those late nights into a narrative of profound parental neglect. He painted a vivid, fabricated picture of Lily wandering a dark house while her mother stared obsessively at glowing monitors. He read out text messages I sent to Preston asking him to pick up groceries because I was patching a server vulnerability, framing them as evidence of my inability to manage a household. I sat there, shrinking into my chair. I let my shoulders round forward. I kept my gaze fixed on my hands, which I clasped tightly in my lap. I was playing a role, and the character I inhabited was a defeated, emotionally shattered woman, watching her life disintegrate before her eyes. In reality, my pulse rested at a calm 60 beats per minute. I analyzed the tactics Vance deployed the exact same way I evaluated a flawed algorithm. He was applying pressure to the wrong variable, but I needed him to believe his strategy was working perfectly. When the topic shifted to Caldwell Analytics, I introduced the vulnerability they were hunting for. I allowed my voice to crack. I spoke haltingly about the brand, the logo, and the client list I had nurtured from a single laptop in my old Doraville apartment. I told them the company was my legacy, my contribution to the world. I wept a single calculated tear, wiping it away quickly to feign a brave front. I made them believe my emotional attachment to the corporate identity was my central fatal weakness. I fed their assumption that I viewed the business as a monument to my own ego, rather than a sequence of intellectual property rights stored on a remote server. They viewed wealth through the lens of physical territory. They thought owning the name on the building meant owning the power inside it. I let them keep that illusion. Marcus, playing his part flawlessly, requested a brief recess to consult with his client. We stood up and stepped out of the conference room. I excused myself and walked down the quiet carpeted hallway to the women's restroom. The space was empty, lined with pristine white marble and bright fluorescent lights that offered no place to hide. I stood in front of the wide mirror, turned on the cold water faucet, and dropped the facade. I stared at my reflection. The tear tracks were gone. My eyes were clear and cold. For a data scientist, deception is just another form of user interface design. You build the front end to show the client exactly what they expect to see, while the back end executes a vastly different set of instructions. I stood in the quiet marble room and practiced my final performance. I widened my eyes to mimic rising panic. I rehearsed a ragged, shallow breathing pattern. I let my jaw tremble just enough to convey unbearable grief without crossing into theatrical absurdity. It was a clinical, calculated rehearsal of devastation. I washed my hands, dried them on a thick paper towel, and reconstructed the shattered wife before pulling open the heavy wooden door. We returned to the conference room and took our seats. The air felt heavier now, dense with the anticipation of a kill. Vance leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, but he did not speak. He deferred to Preston, allowing my husband the profound satisfaction of delivering the finishing blow. Preston adjusted his expensive cuffs. He looked at me with an expression of magnanimous pity, the generous victor offering terms to the vanquished outsider. He spoke in a soft, reasonable tone, the exact same voice he used to charm venture capitalists and logistics managers during steak dinners. He told me he did not want to drag our daughter through a toxic public trial. He claimed he cared deeply about my mental well-being and wanted to offer a swift, clean resolution to our conflict. Then he laid the snare on the table. He offered a compromise that sounded like salvation. I would drop his emergency motion for primary custody. He would grant me full legal and physical custody of Lily, along with child support calculated at the bare state minimum. In exchange, I would sign over 100% of my equity in Caldwell Analytics. He would take the brand, the client list, the office lease, and all associated corporate assets. He framed this extortion as a noble sacrifice on his part, claiming he was stepping away from daily parental duties to shoulder the heavy burden of running the empire we built. I shifted my gaze to the corner of the room. Vivian sat up straighter in her leather chair. She nodded eagerly, a swift, sharp motion that betrayed her desperate greed. Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of the heist. She believed she had just orchestrated the legal theft of a multi-million-dollar tech firm without spending a single day learning how the technology functioned. She thought she was securing her aristocratic legacy, ensuring the Caldwell name would remain plastered across Atlanta high-rises for another generation. She viewed me as a temporary contractor they had finally dismissed. I looked back at Preston. I let the silence stretch across the mahogany table, simulating an agonizing internal debate. I raised my hands to my face, ensuring my fingers shook visibly for the lawyers to document. I let out a jagged, defeated sigh that echoed softly in the cold room. I looked at Marcus, who offered a solemn, slow nod of resignation, playing the part of the defeated counsel. I turned my attention back to the men across the table, my voice barely above a whisper, thick with manufactured sorrow. I told them they could have the company. I told them I just wanted my daughter. The shift in the room was palpable the moment I offered my verbal surrender. The hostile interrogation dissolved into a brisk administrative efficiency. Sterling, the opposing counsel, unbuttoned his suit jacket and signaled to his paralegal to begin drafting the binding settlement agreement. He possessed the smug satisfaction of a predator who had just watched his prey give up the struggle. Marcus sat beside me, his demeanor appropriately somber, projecting the image of a defeated advocate comforting a broken client. Beneath the table, however, Marcus tapped his pen against his knee in a steady, rhythmic tempo. We had reached the critical juncture of the operation. The trap was ready, but we needed the targets to step onto the pressure plate. The paralegal emailed the digital copy of the preliminary draft to Marcus for his review. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated his face as he scrolled through the dense legal jargon. The document outlined the transfer of all corporate shares, physical assets, and existing liabilities of Caldwell Analytics directly to Preston. It mandated my immediate resignation as chief executive officer and severed my access to all corporate banking portals. In exchange, the document contained a comprehensive custody waiver, granting me full legal and physical guardianship of Lily with Preston, retaining only minimal supervised visitation rights that he clearly had no intention of utilizing. Marcus read through the stipulations carefully, ensuring the custody ironclad language protected my daughter from any future legal harassment. Then he navigated to the corporate transfer section. He typed a single brief addition into the bottom of a lengthy paragraph detailing the assumption of corporate assets. Subject to all existing vendor and software licensing agreements active at the time of signing. It was 12 innocuous words. To an untrained eye, it was standard corporate boilerplate. A mundane piece of protective phrasing designed to ensure the company continued to honor its external utility contracts and minor software subscriptions. Any competent intellectual property attorney would have immediately flagged that sentence. An IP specialist would have halted the deposition, demanded a full audit of the software architecture, and uncovered the Delaware holding entity I had established months prior. But Sterling was a family law attorney. He operated in the realm of tangible wealth, focusing on real estate portfolios, liquid capital, and projected revenue streams. He saw a tech company generating high monthly cash flow and assumed the proprietary engine was baked inherently into the corporate entity itself. He never asked to review the vendor agreements because he assumed Caldwell Analytics was the ultimate owner of the technology, not merely a client leasing it. Preston was even more predictable. My soon-to-be ex-husband built his entire career on charm-firm handshakes and curated appearances. He possessed a profound, enduring aversion to reading fine print. Throughout our marriage, whenever complex financial documents or technical specifications required review, he would simply skim the bold headings and sign the final page, trusting his ability to talk his way out of any unforeseen complications. He viewed reading contracts as an administrative task beneath his executive status. Marcus forwarded the revised draft back to opposing counsel. Sterling scanned the changes for less than 30 seconds. He verified that the core asset transfer remained intact and ignored the addendum entirely. He printed the final physical copies on thick legal paper and slid the stack across the polished mahogany table. Preston retrieved his gold monogrammed pen from his breast pocket. The heavy metal caught the fluorescent light overhead. He did not read the pages. He flipped directly to the back of the packet, searching for the signature lines. I watched him as he navigated to the custody waiver. This was the document that legally stripped him of his child. This was the page that reduced his role in Lily's life to an occasional weekend visitor. A decent man would have paused. A father with a shred of conscience would have hesitated, perhaps feeling a pang of sorrow for the family he was dismantling. Preston did not even break his rhythm. He pressed the gold nib to the paper and signed away his daughter with a fluid, practiced stroke. His eyes remained fixed entirely on the subsequent pages, eager to reach the corporate ownership lines. He traded his own flesh and blood for a logo and a corner office without a second thought. A cold, heavy knot of disgust settled in my stomach, swiftly followed by a profound wave of relief. Watching him discard our child so effortlessly extinguished any lingering doubt I harbored about the severity of my retaliation. He was not a victim of my deception. He was the architect of his own ruin. I signed my portion of the documents, keeping my hands steady, sealing the trap around him. The timeline of the legal process brings us back to the humid morning in the Fulton County Courthouse. The deposition agreements required formal judicial approval to become a binding decree. I sat at the petitioner table, staring at the condensation sliding down my water glass, watching the culmination of my long clinical performance. Preston sat across the center aisle in his expensive charcoal suit. Vivian sat beside him in her navy silk dress, her posture rigid with aristocratic pride. She viewed the courtroom proceedings as a coronation. The official moment, her family reclaimed their rightful dominance over the hired help. The judge reviewed the settlement packet, flipping through the heavy pages with a practiced indifference. He asked if I understood the stipulations, confirming that I was willingly surrendering my equity in the predictive logistics firm I had founded. Beside me, my father leaned in. Jim Lancaster had watched me endure years of condescension and financial extraction. He knew the exact dimensions of the payload I was about to drop on the Caldwell dynasty. "Sign it all away, El," he whispered, his voice a low rumble of solidarity. I picked up my cheap plastic pen and signed the final decree. Across the aisle, Vivian let out a sharp, satisfied breath. She offered a tight smirk, leaning over to whisper a congratulatory remark into her son's ear. Preston capped his gold pen and looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and triumph. The judge struck his wooden gavel against the sounding block. The marriage was legally terminated. Caldwell Analytics officially belonged to my ex-husband. I packed my legal pads, stood up, and walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance. I pushed through the heavy double doors of the courthouse and stepped out into the blinding Georgia sun. The heat radiated off the concrete pavement, sweet and oppressive. My father walked beside me in comfortable silence until we reached his parked truck in the adjacent garage. I sat in the passenger seat, unlatched my briefcase, and pulled out my laptop. I tethered the device to my mobile network, watching the connection icon turn solid green. I opened the terminal window, staring at the dark screen and the blinking cursor. Caldwell Analytics was currently running its daily predictive models, routing thousands of freight shipments across the southeastern seaboard. The clients were relying on the continuous flow of optimized data. Preston believed he now controlled that flow. I typed the execution script into the command line. The script communicated directly with the servers hosted under Lancaster Data Solutions. It initiated the termination clause buried within the software licensing agreement. I hit the enter key. The command executed in less than a second. Deep within the cloud infrastructure, the digital authorization keys, linking the proprietary algorithm to the Caldwell Analytics user interface, were instantly revoked. The data pipelines slammed shut. The live tracking dashboards went blank. The predictive routing models ceased to exist. I did not just close a door on their business. I evaporated the entire building. Caldwell Analytics went dark, transformed instantly into an empty, useless shell. The weekend passed with the quiet grace of a closed chapter. Monday morning arrived, bringing the heavy, humid heat that defines Atlanta in late spring. Inside the sleek glass-walled offices of Caldwell Analytics in Buckhead, the air conditioning ran at a crisp 68 degrees. Preston walked through the double doors at 9:15. He wore a fresh navy suit, a silk tie, and carried a cup of artisan coffee. He offered bright, victorious smiles to the reception staff as he passed their desks. He felt like a king stepping into his newly conquered castle. He had spent his entire life inheriting things he did not earn, and this software company was simply his latest aristocratic acquisition. He walked past the open floor plan where junior analysts sat at their workstations and strode directly into the corner office. It was the office I had designed. It was the office I had occupied for 3 years. He sat down in the ergonomic leather chair, spun halfway around to admire the skyline view of the city, and set his coffee on the polished oak desk. Preston had a morning routine he intended to maintain, a ritual designed to prove he was firmly in charge of his new empire. Every Monday at 9:30, Caldwell Analytics ran a comprehensive predictive routing model for a major freight carrier operating out of the port of Savannah. This specific client accounted for 1/3 of the monthly operating revenue. The client relied on our data pipelines to tell them which shipping lanes would experience congestion, which weather patterns would delay cargo ships, and how to reroute thousands of tractor trailers to save fuel costs. The generation of this data was automated, but the chief executive was required to log into the master dashboard, verify the output, and authorize the final transmission. Preston opened his laptop. He cracked his knuckles, feeling the profound satisfaction of unchallenged authority, and clicked the shortcut to the proprietary interface. I expected the familiar loading screen, the sleek geometric corporate logo followed by cascading streams of green and blue data visualizers. He expected the numbers to populate the screen, proving his wealth and status were secure. Instead, the browser window turned a stark, blinding white. A tiny black font appeared in the upper left corner. The text read 404 error. Target not found. Preston blinked. He frowned, assuming he had misclicked or typed the wrong password. He refreshed the page. The screen flashed white again. The same stark error message stared back at him. He navigated to the secondary administrative portal. Target not found. He tried to access the historical database, the archived client ledgers, and the live mapping overlay. Every single portal returned the exact same void. The dashboards were blank. The graphical user interfaces were gone. The data pipelines were severed at the root. Preston did not understand how software architecture functioned. He viewed the internet as a magic trick that happened behind a screen. He assumed this was a minor glitch, a temporary hiccup in the local network. He hit the refresh key 5 more times, tapping the plastic button with increasing force. The screen refused to change. His patience vanished. He stood up from the leather chair, his face flushing red, and marched out of the corner office. He headed straight for the small cluster of desks near the break room where our junior IT support staff worked. He cornered a young network technician named Toby. Toby was a recent college graduate hired specifically to manage local hardware issues like broken printers and forgotten email passwords. Toby had never touched the core predictive algorithm. Preston slammed his hand on Toby's desk, rattling a stack of file folders and a plastic pen cup. Fix the Wi-Fi. Preston demanded, his voice echoing across the open floor plan. The connection in my office is broken. I have a transmission due in 10 minutes for Savannah. Fix it right now before I fire you. Toby looked up, startled by the sudden hostility. He opened his own network monitoring tools. He checked the office router, the bandwidth usage, and the external connection status. Toby informed Preston that the Wi-Fi was operating perfectly. The local network was flawless. Toby then tried to ping the master database server to diagnose the issue. Toby stared at his monitor, his eyes widening behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He typed a few more commands into his terminal, trying to find the host server. Mr. Caldwell, Toby said, his voice shaking slightly. The Wi-Fi is fine. The servers are not responding. In fact, the host destination does not exist anymore. It is like the entire back-end infrastructure has been evaporated. Preston stared at the young technician. He did not possess the technical vocabulary to comprehend what Toby was saying. Preston assumed I had thrown a petty tantrum. He believed I had changed the passwords or unplugged a physical wire in the basement out of sheer spite before surrendering the company. He thought I was being vindictive, trying to embarrass him on his first official day in power. He pulled his mobile phone from his jacket pocket and dialed my number, pacing furiously near the glass walls of the break room. I sat in the corner office of my new workspace in Sandy Springs. The room smelled of fresh paint and expensive coffee. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the plush rug beneath my desk. Lily sat on my lap, humming quietly as she colored a picture of a yellow dog with a waxy crayon. I wore a comfortable cashmere sweater and tailored slacks, feeling a profound sense of physical lightness. My phone buzzed on the desk. The caller identification displayed Preston's name. I let it ring 3 times to establish the pace of the conversation. I tapped the screen to answer and placed the device on speakerphone. Elowen Preston yelled into the receiver. His voice was frantic, stripped of all its usual country club charm. What did you do to the servers? Turn the system back on. Savannah is waiting for their routing schedules, and I cannot get past a blank screen. Fix the network right now. I stroked Lily's hair, watching her select a green crayon for the dog's collar. I kept my voice in the same calm clinical register I used when presenting quarterly earnings to indifferent shareholders. I did not break anything. Preston, I replied softly. The system is operating exactly as the legal documents dictate. What are you talking about? He demanded, breathing heavily into the phone. The dashboards are gone. Toby says the host destination is deleted. You sabotaged the company on your way out. I will have Sterling haul you back into court for this. I own Caldwell Analytics. You signed it over to me on Friday. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished wood of my new desk. You do own Caldwell Analytics. I explained, my tone patient and unbothered. You own the brand name. You own the corporate logo. You own the office furniture and the commercial lease. You also own the $3 million in commercial debt you secretly accrued. But Caldwell Analytics does not own the predictive algorithm. There was a sharp silence on the line. I could picture him standing in the middle of his stolen office, the blood draining from his face as the reality of his ignorance began to take shape. The Lancaster algorithm is the exclusive intellectual property of Lancaster Data Solutions. I continued laying out the facts with surgical precision. Caldwell Analytics merely leased that software on a revocable month-to-month basis. If you read the addendum to the settlement agreement you signed with your gold pen, you would have noticed that the transfer of your company was subject to all existing vendor contracts. Preston stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. He tried to speak, but only a sharp, panicked breath came through the speaker. Upon the change of executive leadership on Friday, Lancaster Data Solutions officially exercised its right to revoke the software license, I said. Your company no longer has access to the technology. The data pipelines are permanently closed to you. You cannot do this, he finally choked out. The shipping hubs need those routing schedules today. We will lose the contracts. We will go bankrupt. Elowen, please. Turn the license back on. I watched Lily hold up her drawing, smiling at the messy yellow dog. I kissed her forehead and turned my attention back to the glowing phone on my desk. I am a vendor now, Preston, I said, allowing the chill of the air conditioning to steep into my words. I am happy to reinstate the software license for Caldwell Analytics. We offer a comprehensive enterprise package for corporate clients. The licensing fee is $250,000 a month, payable immediately. Preston hung up the receiver and stared at the blank monitor. The silence in the corner office felt heavier than it had 10 minutes prior. The panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline offered no comfort, only a sprawling reminder of the empire he thought he had conquered. He sat in his ergonomic leather chair, the reality of his situation beginning to solidify and press down on his chest like a physical weight. He had orchestrated a hostile takeover of a luxury vehicle that possessed no engine. The junior network technician stood hovering near the glass door, shifting his weight from foot to foot, waiting for technical instructions that Preston did not possess the vocabulary to give. Preston dismissed the young man with a sharp wave of his hand, demanding privacy as his mind scrambled to find a solution to an impossible mathematical equation. The logistics industry operates on razor-thin margins of time. A delay of 2 hours at a loading dock creates a ripple effect that costs freight carriers thousands of dollars in wasted fuel, spoiled goods, and driver overtime pay. My predictive algorithm prevented those ripples from forming. The code analyzed weather patterns, traffic density, and port congestion in real time, constantly adjusting the delivery routes to ensure maximum efficiency. Without that digital foresight, the chaos of the supply chain returned instantly. Within 48 hours, the major shipping hubs realized they were navigating blind. The automated routing schedules for Savannah, Charleston, and Jacksonville failed to generate on their morning servers. Dispatchers stared at empty software clients, clicking refresh buttons that returned only void screens. Trucks sat idling in staging lots along the coast. Container ships waited at port berths while dock workers scrambled to manually assign load priorities using whiteboards and paper ledgers. A shipment of perishable agricultural goods bound for a distributor in the Midwest sat in a humid Georgia lot for an extra day, because the automated temperature routing protocol never dispatched the refrigerated trailers. The inbox of Caldwell Analytics began to overflow. The initial messages were confused inquiries from regional shift managers asking for routine status updates. By Tuesday afternoon, the confusion morphed into outright panic as the delays compounded. By Wednesday morning, the panic crystallized into swift legal action. The breach of contract notices flooded the corporate servers. Certified letters arrived via overnight courier, stacking up on the polished wood of the reception desk in a neat, terrifying pile. Preston watched his unread email counter climb higher every hour, a digital odometer ticking toward his ruin. He did not know how to write a manual routing schedule. He did not know how to read a regional weather delay report and translate it into a logistical detour. He only knew how to sell the illusion that he could, faced with systemic operational failure. Preston defaulted to his only survival mechanism. He tried to charm his way out of the deficit. He reached out to the regional operations director for their largest logistics client in Savannah, a rugged industry veteran named Marcus Thorne. Preston scheduled an emergency lunch at the Capital City Club, a bastion of old Southern wealth where deals were traditionally smoothed over with expensive scotch and firm handshakes. Preston believed the plush velvet chairs, the ambient lighting, and the exclusive atmosphere would soften the blow of the missing data. He believed he could pacify the angry director with promises of a temporary software migration and an upgraded user interface. Preston arrived early wearing a fresh tailored suit, projecting the relaxed confidence of a seasoned executive who had everything under control. Marcus Thorne arrived 15 minutes late. The operations director did not wear a suit. He wore a rumpled polo shirt carrying the deep exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 2 days manually untangling a logistics nightmare. Marcus did not sit back in his chair. He leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the pristine white tablecloth, ignoring the leather-bound menu the waiter offered. Preston attempted to order a round of expensive drinks to ease the tension, deploying his signature smile. Marcus cut him off before the waiter could even leave the table. The operations director demanded to know exactly when the routing algorithm would come back online. He did not care about corporate restructuring. He did not care about Preston finalizing a messy divorce. He only cared that his truck drivers were losing hours of service waiting for directives that never arrived, costing his company a fortune every single hour. Preston offered a polished, empty corporate apology. He used phrases like transitional friction and temporary data migration. He promised the system would be fully operational by the end of the quarter. Marcus stared at him, his hardening as he recognized the hollow rhetoric of a man who had no idea how his own product functioned. The operations director stood up, tossing his cloth napkin onto the table. He informed Preston that their contract was officially terminated for cause effective immediately. He promised that a team of corporate lawyers would be seeking damages for the lost revenue. Marcus walked out of the dining room before the appetizers even left the kitchen, leaving Preston alone at a table set for two. Preston returned to his Buckhead office, his aristocratic armor fractured. The reality of his incompetence was no longer a secret confined to his marriage. It was a known fact spreading rapidly across the southeastern logistics sector. But the loss of his biggest clients was merely the prologue to the true devastation. The fatal blow arrived at 3 p.m, delivered via a phone call from the commercial lending division of a major regional bank. During our marriage, Preston had secretly taken out multiple commercial loans against the projected revenue of Caldwell Analytics. He used that capital to fund his hotel trysts and his mother's failing real estate properties. The bank underwriters had approved those loans based on a very specific set of risk factors. They approved the staggering debt because my algorithm guaranteed a steady, predictable cash flow. When the final divorce decree became public record, officially severing my legal ties to the company, the bank triggered an automatic risk assessment. The loan officer on the phone was polite but unyielding. He informed Preston that the departure of the primary technical founder constituted a material change in the operational stability of the business. The bank required immediate proof of operational capacity to maintain the current credit facility. They requested a live demonstration of the software architecture and a verified revenue projection for the upcoming fiscal quarter. Preston felt the blood drain from his face. He had no software to demonstrate. He had no revenue to project because every major client had canceled their service. He offered the loan officer the same empty promises he gave the logistics director, trying to spin a tale of corporate restructuring and bright future horizons. The bank did not operate on charm. The institution operated on data. The loan officer reviewed the sudden influx of contract terminations, hitting the industry wire. He evaluated the empty shell of Caldwell Analytics and made a swift mathematical decision. He informed Preston that the institution was initiating a margin call on the entire commercial debt portfolio. $3 million was due in full, payable immediately, or the bank would begin seizing assets. When the commercial lending division executed the margin call on Preston, the financial devastation did not stop at his desk. Banks do not care about the title on a business card or the charming smile of a newly appointed chief executive. Financial institutions follow the ink on the foundational promissory notes. When Caldwell Analytics secured its first major round of institutional funding 3 years prior to upgrade our server infrastructure, I attempted to use my own credit history to guarantee the note. Vivian stopped me. She marched into the branch manager's office draped in expensive cashmere, and insisted that any enterprise bearing her son's name must be backed by Caldwell Capital. She co-signed the multi-million-dollar credit facility that afternoon. She did not provide her signature out of maternal generosity or a desire to support our growing technology firm. She provided it to establish dominance. She wanted her name on the financial bedrock of my company, so she could remind me at every holiday dinner that my success existed solely by her grace. She viewed that signature as a permanent leash, a tool to control the new money tech girl who had married into her family. She never imagined that her instrument of control would transform into a financial anchor. Preston called his mother in a blind panic the moment the bank demanded the $3 million. He explained the empty servers, the canceled logistics contracts, and the sudden terrifying demands of the loan officers. He begged her for a solution. Vivian, however, did not panic. She possessed an unwavering, deeply ingrained belief that the rules of mathematics simply did not apply to people with her zip code. She viewed the margin call not as a catastrophic institutional action, but as a minor clerical error executed by overzealous bank employees who did not understand how legacy families operated. That evening, Vivian was scheduled to attend the annual spring charity auction at the Piedmont Driving Club. It was a high society gala, the exact sort of event where Atlanta's old aristocracy gathered to drink expensive champagne, trade local gossip, and quietly measure each other's worth. Vivian decided to attend the function despite her son's frantic phone call. She wore a stunning silver evening gown, her signature pearl necklace resting heavy against her collarbone. She intended to locate the senior vice president of the commercial lending division, a man named Richard Hayes, who was a frequent guest and a prominent donor at these specific functions. She planned to offer Richard a charming smile, a polite laugh, and a quiet request to grant her son a brief grace period. She genuinely thought a simple social transaction, a graceful touch on the arm between old friends, could erase a massive commercial deficit. Vivian found Richard standing near a carved ice sculpture in the center of the main ballroom, nursing a glass of bourbon. She approached him with her head held high, extending her hand and deploying the syrupy southern charm she had used for decades to manage local politicians and country club board members. She greeted him warmly, making a lighthearted joke about the stress of corporate transitions, and smoothly asked him to clear up the little misunderstanding regarding Preston's business accounts. Richard did not laugh at her joke. He did not return her warm smile. He looked at Vivian with the cold, detached professionalism of a mortician evaluating a client. He stepped back deliberately, removing his arm from her grasp. He kept his voice low, ensuring the other wealthy guests could not hear the specific details of the conversation, but his tone was unmistakable and ruthless. He informed her that the margin call was not a misunderstanding. It was a formal, non-negotiable execution of the loan terms. He explained that when the bank underwriters attempted to secure the collateral, earlier that afternoon they discovered the alarming state of her personal finances. Richard did not sugarcoat the reality. He told her the bank had already frozen her personal checking accounts. They had frozen her retirement portfolios. The legal department was currently drafting the paperwork to place a lien against her sprawling Tudor estate in Buckhead. Vivian felt the breath leave her lungs. The elegant silver gown suddenly felt like a straitjacket constricting her chest. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling beneath the ambient chandelier light. She tried to maintain her composure, attempting to dismiss his claims as an embarrassing administrative oversight that her personal accountant would rectify by morning. Richard simply offered a curt, unsympathetic nod. He advised her to retain bankruptcy counsel and walked away, leaving the Caldwell matriarch standing entirely alone next to a melting swan. The humiliation compounded only moments later. Desperate to escape the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom, Vivian retreated to the coat check in the lobby. She handed the young attendant her premium black credit card to cover the mandatory valet donation required to retrieve her vehicle. The attendant swiped the card through the terminal, frowned at the screen, and swiped it a second time. The machine emitted a sharp, loud beep, flashing a declined status in bright red letters. Several prominent socialites waiting in the valet line fell silent. The ambient chatter of the lobby evaporated. The whispers started instantly rustling through the crowd like wind through dry leaves. The women Vivian had spent years judging and manipulating were now watching her card bounce over a $20 parking fee. The flawless facade she had spent decades meticulously guarding shattered in front of the exact audience she feared most. She snatched the plastic card from the attendant, her hands shaking uncontrollably, and fled into the humid night air without paying. She drove back to the Buckhead estate in a state of shock and summoned Preston. They sat in the dim light of the formal living room, surrounded by expensive antique furniture that technically no longer belonged to them. The reality of their ruin settled over the quiet house. The software company was an empty shell generating zero revenue. The bank accounts were locked. The ancestral home was destined for imminent foreclosure. The luxury vehicles would be repossessed by the end of the week. They had spent years harvesting my late-night labor to fund their grand illusions. They had treated me as a disposable resource, a quiet machine meant to generate wealth while they enjoyed the prestige. Now the harvest was gone and the soil was salted. Preston sat with his head in his hands, the arrogant country club executive reduced to a terrified boy. Vivian paced the Persian rug, her silver gown rustling, her mind racing through her exhausted list of political and social contacts. There was no one left to call. No investor would touch a logistics firm that possessed no routing algorithm. No bank would extend a lifeline to a family drowning in unsecured debt. The silence in the room stretched until the final inescapable truth became clear to both of them. There was only one asset left in the world that held any actual value. It was the predictive engine I had legally extracted and secured behind a corporate firewall. And there was only one person on Earth who controlled the digital keys to that engine. They realized they had to swallow their immense pride. They had to cross the city and confront the woman they thought they had discarded in a courtroom just days prior. Preston grabbed his car keys from the antique side table. Vivian smoothed the front of her ruined dress, her face a mask of desperate determination. They walked out of the dark estate, got into his vehicle, and drove north toward my new address. The offices of Lancaster Data Solutions occupied the top floor of a newly constructed high-rise in Sandy Springs, a world away from the stuffy traditional architecture of the Caldwell estate. Unlike the heavy, dark mahogany aesthetic of Preston's stolen workspace, my new headquarters was built on light transparency and relentless forward momentum. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered an unobstructed view of the northern tree canopy flooding the open floor plan with bright morning sun. Dozens of engineers and data analysts moved seamlessly between collaborative spaces, monitoring live freight routing metrics on large digital whiteboards. The air hummed with the quiet, focused energy of a thriving enterprise, executing complex problem-solving in real time. I sat at my desk inside a glass-walled corner office reviewing a software deployment schedule when the elevator doors chimed open at the far end of the hall. Preston and Vivian didn't stop at the reception desk. They marched past the security turnstiles, ignoring the polite requests of the front desk manager who tried to hand them visitor badges. Vivian still wore her silver evening gown from the disastrous country club gala the night before. The expensive silk fabric was wrinkled, stained near the hem, and her posture lacked its usual aristocratic stiffness. She looked exhausted, her makeup smudged beneath her eyes. Preston trailed slightly behind her, wearing the same charcoal suit he wore in the courtroom. His tie loosened his face, pale and drawn. They looked like refugees fleeing a conquered territory, searching for a border crossing that no longer existed. They were entirely out of their element in a space governed by intellect rather than inherited prestige. They stormed into my office without knocking. The heavy glass door swung shut behind them, sealing us in a soundproof cube. Beyond the glass walls, a few of my senior analysts glanced up from their monitors, noticing the intrusion. I offered my team a brief, reassuring nod. I wanted an audience to witness this, but I wanted them safely separated from the impact zone. Vivian marched directly to my desk, planting both hands flat on the polished wood surface. She attempted to summon the commanding presence she had wielded for decades, the same syrupy dominance she used to close my laptop at garden parties and belittle my career. But the performance was incredibly hollow today. The panic beneath her skin was visible, radiating from the frantic, uneven pulse beating at the base of her throat. "Turn the machines back on." Elowen Vivian commanded, her voice, brittle and sharp, echoing slightly in the enclosed room. "Stop this childish tantrum right now. We have indulged your little dramatic exit long enough. You are ruining the logistics contracts and you are embarrassing our family in front of the entire city. Fix the network." We need the routing algorithms active before the banks open their secondary review. I didn't stand up. I remained seated in my ergonomic chair, my hands resting lightly on the armrests. I observed her ruined silver gown, and the desperate, frantic energy vibrating through her frame. She still believed she held authority. She still thought I was a rogue employee throwing a temporary fit rather than the architect of her impending bankruptcy. Preston stepped forward, moving out from behind his mother's shadow. He tried a different tactic, opting for the charming negotiation strategy that had failed him at the Capital City Club the previous afternoon. Please. Preston begged, forcing a strained, unnatural smile that didn't reach his eyes. We can work this out. I know you are upset about the divorce terms. I know you feel slighted by how quickly everything moved. But you don't have to destroy the business. Come back to the Buckhead office. I will give you your job back. We can reinstate you as the lead developer. You can have your old salary plus a performance bonus. Just reboot the algorithms so the shipping hubs stop canceling their accounts and the loan officers back off. He offered to give me my job back at a company he stole from me using money he didn't possess. The sheer scale of his ignorance was breathtaking. He still viewed software as a physical machine with an on and off switch, failing to comprehend the legal canyons separating his empty brand from my proprietary code. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice or match their frantic energy. The calmest person in a room full of panic is always the one holding the ledger. I opened the top drawer of my desk, retrieved a thick manila folder, and withdrew a single printed spreadsheet. I slid the crisp white paper across the polished desk toward them. Look at the dates, I said, keeping my tone as clinical as a surgeon reviewing an X-ray. Preston and Vivian looked down at the spreadsheet. It was a comprehensive financial timeline meticulously structured to remove any ambiguity. It documented the exact chronological progression of Preston's embezzlement. It listed the precise dates and routing numbers for the phantom vendor accounts. It highlighted the cash transfers flowing directly into Vivian's failing property management firm to cover her slate roof repairs and country club dues. It cross-referenced those stolen funds with the luxury hotel charges in Midtown and the flight records to the Bahamas. But the spreadsheet didn't stop at the theft. The timeline continued into the corporate restructuring phase. It showed the date I registered Lancaster Data Solutions in Delaware, behind layers of privacy shields. It documented the exact. I filed the intellectual property transfer with the state of Georgia, legally moving the predictive software out of their reach, while Preston was sunbathing on a stolen vacation. Finally, the timeline ended on the day of the divorce deposition. I picked up a yellow highlight from my pen cup. I reached across the desk and drew a bright, luminescent line through the final entry on the page. It was a direct quote from the settlement agreement they had signed. Subject to all existing vendor and software licensing agreements active at the time of signing. I read aloud, letting the words hang in the quiet air of the glass office. Preston stared at the highlighted text, his mouth opening and closing as the legal trap finally became clear to his untrained mind. He realized that the 12 innocuous words he ignored had stripped him of a multi-million-dollar empire. "You didn't want a business, Preston," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "You wanted a crown. I just gave you a very heavy one." Vivian snatched the paper from the desk, her eyes scanning the itemized list of her own complicity. She saw the undeniable proof that her survival had been funded by the woman she treated like a vulgar servant. She realized I had known about the theft for months. I had sat in her formal dining room listening to her insults, watching her steal from my child's future, all while quietly building the guillotine. The arrogance drained from Vivian's face, replaced by a profound, naked terror. The reality of the bank lion on her Tudor estate and the frozen retirement accounts suddenly carried the permanent weight of an eviction notice. She understood that I held the digital keys to their only potential salvation, realizing that threats and corporate demands held no power in my territory. Vivian pivoted to the only weapon she had left. She abandoned the commanding tone of the Buckhead matriarch and attempted her classic emotional manipulation. Her eyes filled with manufactured tears, and her voice softened into a desperate pleading whisper. "Elowen, we are family," Vivian said, reaching across the desk to touch my hand. I pulled my hand away before her fingers could make contact. You can't do this to us. Think about family unity. Think about what this financial ruin will do to little Lily. She deserves to grow up in a stable environment. She deserves her legacy. You are punishing an innocent child just to settle a petty score with us. She weaponized my daughter, attempting to use my own maternal instinct as a shield against her bankruptcy. She thought guilt could breach a fortress that logic had built. I stared her down, perfectly calm. The tears spilling over Vivian's eyelashes were a masterclass in theatrical grief. She squeezed my hand, attempting to transmit a fabricated maternal warmth through her fingertips. For a brief second, I studied her face the way I might study a corrupted string of code. I observed the frantic pulse in her neck, the slight tremor in her jaw, and the desperate calculation hiding behind her wet eyes. She assumed my maternal instinct was a vulnerability she could exploit. She thought invoking my daughter would trigger a protective panic that would somehow override my logic and force me to surrender my leverage. She did not understand that my maternal instinct was the exact reason I built the trap in the first place. I smoothly withdrew my hand from her grasp, resting my palms flat on the polished surface of my desk. I looked at the matriarch of the Caldwell family, feeling nothing but a profound, sterile emptiness where my fear used to live. You do not get to invoke family unity. Vivian, I said softly. My voice carried the crisp, unyielding tone of a judge delivering a final verdict. Family unity is a concept built on mutual respect and shared burdens. You viewed my presence in your home as an unfortunate social tax you had to endure to access my bank accounts. You sat in your pristine dining room and plotted to take my child away from me simply because I dared to ask where my money was going. You used Lily as a weapon to secure your own financial survival. You are not a grandmother seeking a stable environment. You are a bankrupt landlord begging for a rent extension. Vivian opened her mouth to protest, her face flushing a deep mottled red beneath her expensive cosmetics. I raised a single finger, silencing her instantly. The power dynamic in the room had irreversibly shifted and her aristocratic reflexes were failing her. Furthermore, I continued, keeping my cadence even and deliberate. You are operating under a fundamental misconception regarding your relationship to my daughter. You assume that because Preston managed to sign a piece of paper in a courtroom, he somehow retained a spiritual claim to his child. You thought the Caldwell legacy would remain intact, carried forward by a girl you intended to mold into a compliant replica of yourself. I opened the second drawer of my desk and retrieved a crisp, formal document bearing the official seal of the Fulton County Court. I slid the paper across the desk, placing it directly over the highlighted spreadsheet. I filed the name change petition early this morning. I explained, watching their eyes dart down to the official seal. The judge signed the order an hour before you walked into my building. Lily is no longer a Caldwell. She is Lily Lancaster. She will never carry a name synonymous with theft, entitlement, and cowardice. She will grow up knowing that value is created through hard work, not inherited through a zip code. You are legally, financially, and emotionally severed from our lives. You have no granddaughter. Preston has no daughter. You have nothing but the debt you accrued trying to maintain an illusion. Preston leaned heavily against the glass wall of the office, his breathing shallow and rapid. The reality of his total isolation was finally penetrating his thick layer of ego. He realized that his mother could not save him. His charm could not negotiate a truce, and his legal maneuvers had only accelerated his demise. He stared at the name change document, his mouth hanging open in silent shock. He had traded his child for a corporate throne, and now both were gone. In a final, desperate attempt to salvage his dignity, Preston pushed himself away from the glass. He straightened his shoulders, trying to project the authoritative posture of a chief executive brokering a high-stakes merger. Fine, Elowen, Preston said, his voice cracking slightly on the first syllable. You win. You proved your point. But you still need a client-facing entity to market the algorithm. Caldwell Analytics still holds the commercial lease. We still have the brand recognition. I am willing to sell the company back to you. I will transfer all remaining assets and the brand name to Lancaster Data Solutions. You can assume the corporate debt, and we will walk away cleanly. I looked at him, genuinely marveling at his inability to comprehend basic economics. He was attempting to sell me a burning building while standing in the flames. Why would I purchase an empty shell encumbered by $3 million of commercial liability, I asked, tilting my head slightly. Your brand recognition is currently plummeting to zero as every major logistics hub in the Southeast files breach of contract notices against you. The office furniture is leased. The corporate accounts are frozen. Your company possesses a net value in the negative millions. Buying Caldwell Analytics would be a catastrophic investment, and I do not make decisions based on bad math. I stood up from my ergonomic chair, signaling that the meeting was officially concluded. I smoothed the front of my cashmere sweater and looked directly into my ex-husband's eyes. You spent our entire marriage telling everyone that you were the true face of the operation. I said, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet office. You told the investors, the politicians, and your mother that my back-end code was easily replaceable. You insisted that your networking skills and your firm handshakes were the actual assets generating our revenue. I gestured toward the glass door, offering a cold, dismissive smile. Now is your chance to prove it, Preston. Go back to your expensive office. Call your logistics clients. Take them to the Capital City Club and use your impeccable pedigree to fix the supply chain. You wanted the throne so badly. Go sell them an empty box. I reached across my desk and pressed a small silver button on my intercom console. I requested security to my office. Within 30 seconds, 2 broad-shouldered guards wearing dark tailored suits stepped through the glass doors. They did not raise their voices or act physical. They simply stood beside Preston and Vivian, gesturing politely but firmly toward the exit. The transition was stark and immediate. The Caldwells, who had spent their entire lives commanding deference and respect from service workers, were now being treated as hostile trespassers. Vivian clutched her ruined silver gown, her shoulders shaking with silent, humiliated sobs. Preston stared at the floor, his face pale and slack-stripped of every defense mechanism he had ever possessed. They walked out of the glass office, flanked by the security personnel. Beyond my door, the open floor plan had fallen completely silent. Dozens of data analysts, software engineers, and project managers stood at their workstations. My entire staff watched in quiet satisfaction as the remnants of the old Southern aristocracy were marched toward the elevators in total defeat. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic confrontation. There was only the cold, sterile reality of consequence. I watched them walk the length of the hallway. Vivian turned her head right before she stepped into the elevator car. Our eyes met one final time. Her face was a portrait of raw, inescapable horror. The realization that she was returning to a world where her name meant nothing. The metal doors slid shut, sealing them away. I turned away from the glass wall and walked back to my desk. I sat down in my chair and pulled my keyboard toward me. The dual monitors glowed with streams of live data. The predictive models for Lancaster Data Solutions were compiling flawlessly routing freight schedules for a fresh list of clients who valued competence over pedigree. The system was running at peak efficiency. I typed a brief command into the terminal, closing the archived files related to the Caldwell accounts. The anomalies were permanently purged from my system. The data was clean. 6 months is a relatively short period in the context of human history, but in the realm of corporate finance and social standing, it is an eternity. Over the next 180 days, the consequences of the Caldwell family arrogance metabolized with a ruthless mathematical precision. Caldwell Analytics did not merely fold, it imploded under the heavy burden of breached logistics contracts and unpaid commercial loans. The filings for Chapter 7 bankruptcy became public record in early summer. I monitored the court docket from my own desk, watching the judicial system dismantle the hollow shell I had left behind. Court-appointed liquidators swept through the Buckhead high-rise to recoup fractions of the debt. They tagged every item with neon barcode stickers. They auctioned off the imported leather chairs, the frosted glass conference tables, and the high-end espresso machines Preston had purchased to impress venture capitalists. The corporate logo, once a symbol of his stolen pride, was scraped off the double doors by a building maintenance worker earning an hourly wage. The auditors inspected the local servers, searching for the valuable technology that justified the initial bank loans. They found nothing but basic operating systems. The brand Preston tried to trade his daughter for yielded exactly pennies on the dollar at a wholesale liquidation sale. The financial contagion spread rapidly from the corporate ledger directly into their personal accounts. Vivian had weaponized her signature to control my company, and that identical signature ultimately authorized her financial ruin. The regional bank executed the lien against her sprawling Tudor estate. The foreclosure proceedings stripped the matriarch of her ancestral fortress. The liquidation of her assets became a spectacular social event for the people she used to rule. Estate liquidators cataloged the antique mahogany dining set, the Persian rugs, and the silver flatware that had supposedly defined their legacy for 3 generations. The women Vivian used to dominate at garden parties arrived at the estate sale, inspecting her discarded heirlooms with polite, predatory whispers. The proceeds from the property sale barely covered the outstanding interest on the defaulted commercial loans. Destitute and exiled from her zip code, Vivian relocated to a 2-bedroom condominium in Marietta. It is a modest vinyl-sided development adjacent to a discount strip mall located in the exact suburban sprawl she used to mock over mint juleps. She no longer attends charity galas. She pushes her own grocery cart through a crowded supermarket where no one recognizes her maiden name. She spends her days behind closed blinds, hiding from a society that revoked her relevance the exact moment her bank accounts ran dry. Preston experienced a similar steep descent into reality. Without my code to sell or my capital to fund his lifestyle, his inherent lack of talent became glaringly obvious. His membership at the Capital City Club was officially suspended for non-payment of dues. The board posted his name on the delinquent account registry near the locker rooms, ensuring every logistics manager and political donor he used to entertain witnessed his expulsion. Stripped of his luxury vehicle and his tailored suits, Preston secured employment out of sheer necessity. He currently works as a regional sales representative for a mid-sized paper supply company. He sits in a gray cubicle under flickering fluorescent lights, wearing off the rack dress shirts. He spends 40 hours a week reading from a laminated script, cold-calling local accounting firms, trying to charm office managers into purchasing printer toner and bulk copy paper. He struggles to meet his monthly quotas. He drinks bitter coffee from a communal break-room pot miles away from the bourbon tastings he used to expense on my dime. He finally possesses a job that accurately matches his actual skill set. He is selling empty boxes to people who do not want to speak to him. The contrast between their collapse and my ascension is a stark, undeniable metric. The story does not end in a courtroom or a glass office. It ends on a Saturday afternoon in late September. The oppressive heat of the Georgia summer has finally broken, leaving behind a crisp golden autumn light. I am sitting on the wraparound wooden porch of my new home, a sprawling craftsman house situated on 2 acres of quiet wooded land in Roswell. The air smells of pine needles and damp earth. There are no heavy antiques here. There is no suffocating pressure to maintain a flawless facade for politicians. The architecture of this life is built on transparency, warmth, and structural integrity. I hold a mug of warm herbal tea resting my feet against the porch railing. Out in the yard, my father is kneeling in the dark soil of a raised garden bed. Jim wears his familiar faded denim jeans and a worn canvas work jacket. Beside him squats my 3-year-old daughter, Lily Lancaster. She wears denim overalls and bright yellow rubber boots, her small hands covered in dirt. My father is teaching her how to plant late-season tomatoes. He gently guides her fingers, showing her how to loosen the root ball and pack the soil firmly around the base of the delicate green stem. He speaks to her in a low, patient rumble, explaining that a plant needs a strong foundation to bear weight. He is teaching her the exact same lessons he taught me in the Doraville rail yards. He is teaching her how to build things that last. She laughs, a bright, unburdened sound that carries across the open yard, and pats the mud with joyful enthusiasm. She will never know the sterile conditional affection of the Buckhead aristocracy. She will grow up understanding that love is a verb demonstrated through patience, shared labor, and unwavering presence. I take a slow sip of my tea, watching the 2 of them work together in the afternoon sun. I reflect on the true nature of power. For years, I believed power resided in the loud, commanding voices of people who inherited their authority. I thought power was the ability to dictate terms across a mahogany table or close a laptop screen to erase a person from the narrative. I was wrong. True power is not found in pedigree, expensive tailoring, or playing the long-suffering victim. Power is found in the quiet enforcement of boundaries. It is found in undeniable competence. It is found in the profound willingness to step aside and let toxic structures collapse on their own architects. I did not have to raise my voice to dismantle the Caldwell dynasty. I did not have to fight a vicious, protracted war in the mud to keep my daughters safe. I simply stopped functioning as their load-bearing wall. I removed my labor, my intellect, and my capital from their ledger, and allowed the gravity of their own incompetence to pull them down to the earth. My phone sits on the wooden table beside me, silent and unobtrusive. The servers at Lancaster Data Solutions are humming miles away, processing millions of data points, optimizing freight routes for clients who pay me for my mind rather than my compliance. The business is thriving. The legal entanglements are permanently severed. The anomalies have been purged from the system. I close my eyes and listen to the wind rustling through the tall oak trees lining the edge of my property. The data is clean. The house is quiet. The revenge is complete, and it is entirely wonderfully peaceful.
There is a profound stillness that settles over a home when the dust of conflict finally clears. You sit on the porch watching a child's small, dirt-covered hands plant a seed in the soil, and you realize that the most important work of your life is happening right there in the mud. As I reflect on the story of Elowen Preston and Preston Caldwell, I see much more than a tale of corporate espionage or a messy divorce. I see a mirror held up to the modern American family. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when we lose our way as parents, when we confuse the image of success with the actual substance of character. In a culture that increasingly equates human worth with zip codes, designer labels, and curated social media feeds, the Caldwells represent a terrifyingly common trap. They traded the soul of their family for the maintenance of a hollow facade. Let us talk about the illusion of the ego, a trap that so many well-meaning parents fall into. In our society, it is dangerously easy to start viewing our children as extensions of our own ambitions and social standing. We want them to have the right friends, attend the prestigious schools, and wear the right clothes. But when a family's primary value system is built on keeping up appearances, as Vivian's was, the child becomes nothing more than a status symbol. Preston was raised to be a hood ornament on a luxury car, polished, gleaming, and utterly empty inside. He was taught that his last name and his charming smile were enough to carry him through the world, exempting him from the necessity of hard work. When we parent from a place of ego, we teach our children that love is transactional. We teach them that they are only as valuable as the prestige they bring to the family ledger. This is a devastating betrayal of the traditional family structure, which is supposed to be a sanctuary of unconditional support and moral development. Instead of raising a resilient, independent adult, Vivian raised a dependent parasite. She shielded him from accountability, indulging his worst instincts to protect the family name. In doing so, she did not save him. She destroyed his ability to survive in the real world. Parenting is not about crafting a perfect image for the country club. It is about building a human being who has the integrity to stand on their own 2 feet when the applause finally stops. This brings us to the profound necessity of wisdom in raising the next generation. True wisdom is not about intellectual brilliance or the ability to manipulate a situation to your advantage. It is the quiet, often painful courage to see things exactly as they are. Elowen embodied this wisdom. When she discovered the betrayal that had infected her home, she did not scream. She did not throw heavy objects or dissolve into a puddle of self-pity. She looked at the raw data of her life and accepted the truth no matter how much it hurt to acknowledge it. As parents, we must cultivate this kind of emotional awareness in our children. We must teach them to face reality without flinching. We live in a world that constantly encourages us to deny uncomfortable truths, to spin the narrative, and to blame others for our own failures. But the universe operates on a very strict law of cause and effect. You reap exactly what you sow. The Caldwells sowed arrogance, entitlement, and deceit, and they were ultimately crushed by the harvest they planted. If we want our children to thrive, we must stop shielding them from the consequences of their actions. We must let them fail. We must let them feel the weight of their mistakes so they can develop the internal compass required to navigate a complex world. A child who never learns the sting of a natural consequence becomes an adult who believes the rules simply do not apply to them. To raise children with a functional compass, we must root our families in genuine morality and fairness. Real morality has nothing to do with performing for an audience. It is not about wearing the right suit to church on Sunday or writing a check at a charity gala while treating the waitstaff like they are invisible. True morality is found in the dark when no one is watching. It is found in the quiet dignity of doing honest work. Look at the stark contrast between Elowen's father, Jim, and the Caldwell matriarch. Jim spent 40 years in a rail yard, managing heavy loads and building things that lasted. He did not have a pedigree, but he had a profound, unshakable moral core. He taught his daughter how to evaluate structural integrity, how to recognize when a foundation was rotting from the inside out. He loved her enough to tell her the hard truth in that courtroom, to sign it all away, because he knew her character was worth infinitely more than any corporate asset. This is the kind of honesty we must model for our children. We must show them that real wealth is not what you possess, but who you are. It is the ability to treat the vulnerable with compassion, to honor your commitments, and to walk away from a rigged game with your soul intact. Finally, we must talk about the true meaning of willpower and the immense strength it takes to let go. In American culture, we are often taught that strength means fighting to the bitter end, never surrendering and crushing your enemies. But Elowen's story teaches us a far more elevated truth. The most extraordinary display of willpower is not fighting. It is the courage to walk away. It is the strength to set an absolute boundary. For parents, setting boundaries is the ultimate act of family responsibility. When we enable our children, when we swoop in to fix their messes and pay their debts, we are not loving them. We are suffocating their potential. Vivian Caldwell's inability to set boundaries with her son, her constant need to rescue him to protect the family image, was the very thing that doomed him. True emotional resilience requires the discipline to say no. Elowen could have spent years in a bitter, venomous legal battle fighting for every penny and every square inch of her company. She could have let hatred consume her. Instead, she exercised the supreme willpower to let go of the hollow shell. She dropped the rope. By releasing her attachment to the brand, the prestige, and the toxic people who demanded her labor, she found ultimate freedom. If you have ever found yourself trapped in a dynamic where your worth is measured by what you provide rather than who you are, I want you to remember Elowen's quiet victory. You have the power to stop being the load-bearing wall for people who refuse to build their own foundations. If this reflection resonates with the quiet battles you are fighting in your own life, I invite you to join our community. Please drop a comment, share your story, and subscribe to Fluffy Revenge, where we celebrate the profound peace that comes from setting boundaries and walking away from the noise. As the sun sets and the shadows lengthen across the porch, we are left with a thought that echoes far beyond the screen. We spend our entire lives building empires, accumulating assets, and trying to secure a legacy for the ones we love. But when the digital pipelines go dark, when the bank accounts are frozen, and the social invitations stop arriving, what is actually left standing? Look closely at the foundation of your own life. Are you building a resilient engine, or are you just polishing an empty crown? The answer, much like the truth we all eventually have to face, is already written in the data of our daily choices. We just have to be brave enough to read it.